Morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. And some of our panelists are in their afternoons. My name is Serge Bui. I am the CEO of the Agri-Food Innovation Council, and welcome to our second webinar in a series of webinars that we're doing on the future of agri-food research and innovation in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. I will be the moderator for this session. I would like to thank author Oskin Harcourt LP and Farm Credit Canada for sponsoring this event. We are extremely pleased to welcome today three highly talented and experienced international leaders to provide us with their perspective on the role of research and innovation in responding to the challenges of climate change for agriculture. So one question could be asked, why did we organize this webinar? Well, the challenges posed by climate change are not new to Canada's agricultural sector, but there is more and more a growing sense of urgency on the need to take effective action. And you're seeing it from our government, and you're seeing it from various actors in the sector as well. In Canada, the agricultural sector is estimated to account for 10% of the country's GHG emissions. Across the world, agriculture, forestry, and other land use account climbs to 24% of human GHG emissions, according to data from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. There definitely needs to be action, and strong action soon. We are therefore trying to have a discussion and for Canada to be informed by what is happening internationally as well. Therefore, this is why we've done this, to stimulate our thinking about the issue and look at what is being accomplished outside of Canada in support of those goals. And we are therefore joined by Dr. Zitouni Ouldada, Dr. Sally Rocky, and Dr. Claudia Ringler. Before we get into the moderated session, I will briefly introduce them with their names and titles and organization, and ask them to provide a short introduction of themselves, and then we'll move into the moderated section. So Dr. Zitouni Ouldada is a Deputy Director of the Office of Climate Change, Biodiversity and Environment at the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. Dr. Ouldada, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Would you mind giving just a short description of yourself and the organization and the activities of your organization?
Sure, thank you. Thank you first for this invitation. It's really, I'm very pleased to join this panel, and thank you for organizing this series of events. So as you said, my name is Zitouni Ouldada. I'm Deputy Director of the Office of Climate Change, Biodiversity and Environment. It's a newly formed office in FAO. The whole mandate of FAO is to eradicate hunger. So everything we do is towards ensuring food security. So we act both at the global level and at supporting countries to have the capacities, the strategies, and also promoting practices that deal with the impact of climate change, biodiversity loss, and environmental protection in general. So that's what we're about, very briefly.
Great, thank you very much. I will now move on to Dr. Claudia Ringler, who was appointed Deputy Division Director of the Environment and Production Technology Division at the International Food Policy Research Institute in 2011. Dr. Ringler, if you can just introduce yourself and the organization as well.
Yeah, happy to do so. And I'm also glad to join this dialogue today and this panel. So the International Food Policy Research Institute, I'm not sure how many of you have heard of it, but it's a member of CGIAR, which is the world's largest global agriculture innovation network, home to about 8,000 scientists and staff. And we've just recently updated our strategy, and our mission is science and innovation to advance the transformation of food, land, and water systems in a climate crisis. So obviously very, I think, relevant to this topic. And so IFPRI is basically one of 12 to 15 members of the international ag research community. And our own focus is similar to FAO. We provide policy, evidence-based research and insights for policy to reduce hunger, malnutrition, and to do so sustainably. And obviously climate change features very heavily in there. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Ringler. And Dr. Ringler is based out of Montreal. So while the organization is definitely international, she's not far away from us, at least for us here in Ottawa. Although for some people, Montreal is closer to London, England, than it is to Vancouver. So especially in terms of flights. But anyway, I'll move on. Thank you, Dr. Ringler. Dr. Sally Rocky is the Executive Director of the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research. Dr. Rocky, same thing if you want to just say a few words about yourself and the organization as well.
Yes, thank you so much. I am the executive director of what we call FAR, and we are a federally funded nonprofit foundation that funds innovative and what we call audacious science to advance agriculture. We build public-private partnerships, so not only do we aspire to do that, but we're required to do that in that our funding requires a non-federal match. So we really have a great opportunity to work with other organizations. In fact, we've also worked with the organizations of our other two panelists here, FAO, quite closely, and IPRI as well. So that's been really a wonderful collaboration. And I'll just mention what our vision is. We envision a world which pioneering collaborative science provides every person access to affordable, nutritious food grown on thriving farms. So we are small compared to some other organizations that have funding for agricultural science, but we really are targeted with developing these public-private partnerships that put a small amount of money in a really important area that will accelerate progress in that area.
Thank you so much, Thank you so much, Doctor. I appreciate this introduction. I will give first, before we start the questions, a few housekeeping notes to the attendees. The chat bar will not be active. We're going to ask you to please ask your questions using the Q&A window. So on the bottom of the screen, at least on mine, you should have a Q&A window. If you click on that, your question will come up, and you may upvote one of the questions to make sure if you see a question that's extremely relevant to you that one of your colleagues has posed, you may ask for it. You can also ask to raise your hand, and there is a raise your hand button found next to the Q&A bar, and to ask your question verbally. And once identified, you will be invited to unmute yourself to ask your question. But first, we're going to start a few of the questions ourselves, and just to get the ball rolling, we'll ask you a few questions and then go back and forth between prepared questions and questions from the attendees. I'm going to ask the same question to all the panelists. I won't repeat it though, but the first one is really, can you tell us how your organization is helping shape the response to the challenges of climate change in agriculture? What are your research focus and priorities today? What do you see as some of the most promising research areas, and what are you doing to inform policy decisions, which is one of the key roles for AIC? So please, I'm going to start by Dr. Oldada, if that's okay with you, Doctor.
That's fine. Thank you for the question. But let me first start by, the global picture on where agriculture in particular fits in with the impact of climate change. Agriculture is an important contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and therefore to climate change. About a third of emissions, 30% of emissions come from food systems. And that's really, has a big impact on greenhouse gas emissions and therefore on climate change. But at the same time, climate change is also an important part of the solution. Agriculture is also an important part of the solution, pardon me. So this contrast is very important because we often, talk about the emissions coming from agriculture, but actually agriculture has a lot to offer in terms of practices, in terms of carbon sequestration in soil and plants and crops. And this is why it is important to look at agriculture in this broader context. When we zoom in into the food security aspects, at the moment in general, we have around 700 million people who go hungry. And on the other hand, we have around 2 billion people who are obese or overweight. So you can see the challenges go beyond just the climate change dimension, but also the impact on people's health and the food security in general. So agriculture hits so many dimensions. I know we're talking particularly about climate change, but it's related to biodiversity and the health of the environment and the health of people. But in terms of research, FAO is not a research organization, in terms of commissioning research. But we do support research organizations. We do work with research organizations, as Claudia said. The CGIAR is one of the organizations we work with, and Sally for the foundation as well. These are the partnerships that we work with, we support. And the reason for that is obviously given the global nature of climate change. So you need to work with people from different backgrounds, the organizations from different backgrounds, because there are various environmental and socioeconomic aspects that you need to address. In terms of research, I would say, innovation is really important in what we're facing at the moment. It becomes so critical to innovate, to adapt to the new situation, to deal with the challenges, and to look at, how can we best use technology? How can we best use the knowledge to empower farmers, to empower consumers and people in dealing with the various facets of climate change? And this is an area that we're increasingly active on, is innovation, the role of innovation and technology. And I think that the pandemic has highlighted the need for digital technology, for the access to information, to data, to be able to be well informed and take decisions. And this applies not only to government or decision makers, but more importantly to farmers who are on the field, and they need to have access to information. And I mean farmers in the broader sense, big or small or medium. The information becomes very important in knowing, information about the weather, about the market, about the seeds, about the landscape, water availability, etc. So for me, this is one of the important areas that I want to highlight here. So I'll stop it here and look forward to thoughts from the colleagues and then to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Great. And now I'm going to ask Dr. Ringler to answer the same question.
You asked like 3 questions. I'll see to how.
I know it's broad.
Yeah. So yeah, in terms of focus, maybe CGIAR is certainly known for breeding. So, and a lot of the breeding, obviously, to achieve yield growth, which is the overall goal, we need to breed climate resilient crops. So heat and drought tolerance, submergence tolerance, because rice is often grown in deltas. And just like, I think 2 examples that stand out on the rice side is aerobic rice. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's the dancing rice, but actually it's just rice, that you can grow without having standing water. So that can dramatically reduce methane emissions, improve, resilience to a series of abiotic stresses. There's also called C4 rice. And so that again, aims to increase the photosynthetic efficiency of rice, which is otherwise a C3 crop, and basically doesn't do that well in drier and hotter conditions, which climate change, basically will lead to. So basically, we do need a lot on the breeding side, to allow us to produce sufficient food going forward. At the same time, we focus on improving the nutrient density of crops. So there is something called like biofortification, where we're trying to increase the micronutrient value of crops, bringing in zinc and so forth into crops directly. That's also important because as a result of climate change, we have something called nutrient leaching, where actually the quality of the crops we're producing is declining. So I think that's a very, it's a broad area that CGR is focusing on. There's also a program called CCAFS, or research program Climate Change, Agriculture, and Food Security, that also focuses more on the farmer level adaptation practices, climate smart agriculture, and is working directly with UNFCCC bodies to strengthen the attention on the need for agriculture adaptation investments. So that agriculture didn't play much of a role in climate change negotiations in the past. It was very much about mitigation, about energy. And I think agriculture is now definitely a partner, is being considered and talked about, at least at the negotiations. So I think that really matters, and that has been a big role of CGIAR. IFPRI ourselves, we work on basically looking at the economic analysis around these climate resilience investments. A big area there is projections. What is future food security under not only climate change scenarios, alternative scenarios, but also what are the trade implications from climate change? And again, how does the number of people at risk of hunger change as a result of climate change? And obviously the trends are all very negative. The prognosis is very negative. And so this huge, the recent commitments for climate mitigation are very, very welcome from a food insecurity perspective, but only if they are done right. And I think that is something we need to focus on in the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And I will move now to Dr. Rocky.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a great panel, and I appreciate what the two previous panelists just mentioned of some of the important areas. Our foundation, and one of the things that I've experienced, I've been in research, agriculture research and biomedical research for the last almost 40 years. That's hard to say that. But we're seeing that in agriculture, it's really a fantastic time to be in agricultural science because there's so much innovation that is presenting itself directly to problem solving. And this is what the joy of working in agricultural science more than any other discipline, where what you do today in the lab or in the field can be out there, really rapidly as opposed to some other disciplines. So but one of the things that happens in agriculture is we're very fragmented. In other words, there's great science going on across the world, especially in this area of the relationship between agriculture and climate change. And we're all doing good work, but we tend not to come together in large initiatives. We try, but there's just so many people doing great work. We as an organization then are trying to do this. We are trying to bring together what is known about the relationship between agriculture and greenhouse gas reduction in actually an initiative called Ag Mission. And what the idea here is, this is really a big data project because we already know that there's a lot of great data out there. How do we get individuals and organizations to bring those data together, not necessarily in a repository, but connect data that we know is going on, that will really accelerate our ability to provide those data and results to farmers so that they can deploy practices that are really going to make a difference for their particular circumstance. So where they are in the world, their soils, their production practices, what they're producing, et cetera. And if you think about it, these data are very diverse. You can be talking all the way from the genetics, the genomics of as Dr. Ringler just mentioned, the genomics of environmental resilience in plants to methane reduction through feed and animals. And then of course, all this carbon sequestration work and that link to soils is going on. So we are really trying to bring these efforts together and to have a large initiative that will provide this resource that will allow us to move more quickly and accelerate things together. And we love the name Ag Mission because it's a play on the words emission, but it really is about a huge mission here in agriculture. So we're trying to develop that roadmap. We have partners with the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers in Action Alliance, and we also are working globally on this. And we think that if we can try to have really a culture change to really have an initiative to move together and talk with one voice will really accelerate things as quickly as possible. And then empower those, as Dr. Oldata was saying, empower those farmers and producers to make their own decisions, right? So that they can make decisions about information-based practices that they have. Agriculture is a knowledge-based system, so they can empower to do what's best for their circumstance under their own systems. And we are really trying to have farmers at the table at the beginning of this initiative to make sure that it is going in a direction that's going to be most helpful for them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rocky. I appreciate this. And just before I go to my next question, I want to make a couple of comments. Indeed, you've addressed the fact that the sector is very divided, right? And I mentioned siloed in terms of the information flow, et cetera, and we've definitely noticed that in Canada quite a bit. And I know it's an international issue. So bringing people together is absolutely a key element of the solution, without a doubt, and appreciate that. And before I go to our next question, I just wanted to address something. I normally never quote statistics whenever I do an introduction, because as soon as you quote statistics, you have people that will bring other statistics. And I do appreciate Dr. Orechak mentioning that, questioning the information that I put out in terms of the 10%. The thing I will say is the information that I provided at the beginning, the statistic is from our own Canadian government. And I would agree with you, Dr. Orechak, we are, and I'm talking about the Q&As here, it is debatable, and there are other studies now showing up. But I won't get in the debate today, but I'm sure we will get in the debate later on, and I will happily look at this. And thank you for sharing a link with all the participants. Now, going to my next question, what are emerging technologies and practices that you believe will have an impact on how agriculture impacts climate change? And I'm going to start by you, Dr. Ringler, if that is okay.
Yeah, so I mean, we are a global organization, so really we need an amplitude of practices, and clearly in the north, and I see the discussion already starting in the Q&A. So there's a very clear focus on mitigation. And at the same time, of course, farmers are very interested in adaptation. And when we can do both adaptation and mitigation while generating profit, that's the sweet spot where we want to be. And so many of the, crop breeding strategies, also Sally mentioned the importance of data around that. These investments, I think they just have to continue to flow. We see huge variability and overall very low investment in poorer countries, African countries, where GDP is still a very large, large parts generated in agriculture, and where more people are employed in agriculture, the governments are unfortunately not spending the few resources they have on agriculture. So, and that causes this poverty, low productivity, climate change impact spiral that we see there. In richer countries, we do see more sustained investment in agricultural research. But we need to lift the ambition everywhere. So breeding for better crops, that are both mitigating, we can breed nutrient efficiency so that we don't need to use so much fertilizer. We can breed transpiration efficiency so that we don't need so much water. So we need to just do much better there to really, get both the mitigation piece moved forward and the adaptation piece without forsaking productivity and profitability. We don't want to have yet more farmers leave agriculture because they're being told tomorrow you have to use half the fertilizer, and that's it, or you have to retire your land for biodiversity strategies. Everyone wants those outcomes, but there are different ways to generate them. And then I think we need to look outside the box. I mean, outside the traditional ag box, there is huge private sector investment in cell-based meats and cell-based milk, alternative plant-based milks, if people in rich countries would like to consume them, I mean, why, this is a good thing for the environment, also for, and depending on how it's being done, again, there's no generalities, but all in all, thinking about the diets we consume in rich countries, really, taking a second look at that is helpful. It can help actually poor countries if lower, meat consumption, or at least of some livestock products, can reduce prices and actually give more people in poorer countries access to these commodities that they need for, for a healthy life, because they currently often don't have access to these products because they're too expensive. So basically, some of these strategies will not make a huge impact on mitigation because they'll just open markets elsewhere. But all in all, it's on the right track. So basically, direct investments in agriculture, very important, but looking outside the box, cell-based agricultural products should not be discarded. Thinking about diets at home, reducing waste in food losses. So there's a lot of strategies that will all get us to the same goal. But what I'm most worried about is that if we just say, impose severe restrictions on agriculture without considering implications for food insecurity. And I'm very worried that a lot of countries that want to be super ambitious on mitigation, which they need to be, I'm absolutely saying that that's correct, but they do have to do so in ways that don't increase food insecurity. Thank you.
I really appreciate the link between this agenda on global change and the food security aspect. I think you've introduced it all very well, and indeed it is essential to consider both when making decisions. Dr. Rocky, what emerging technology and practices are you seeing that will have an impact on agriculture, on the way agriculture impacts climate change?
So I agree with Dr. Ringler again, so I'll say ditto to the areas she mentioned, but I want to come back to that point that I made earlier about big data and using technology such as in artificial intelligence and in deep learning, machine learning to help us. If we think about data, I was the deputy at the National Institutes of Health for many years, and we spent a lot of money on big data on humans. And if you think about that, that's one animal, right? Think about how complex the data systems are in agriculture. We're talking about land, sky, soils, animals, plants, people, all of it has to be connected. So there's an overwhelming amount of data in agriculture. And really in the way that we figure out what is valued data, I have a term for that. I call it DOVE, data of value, which is the V and the E together on value, and how we use those data and data systems to advance us agriculturally. And so this is very complex, and we need to apply all the technologies we can in artificial intelligence and other areas to do a couple things. One, to be able to understand the system, the entire agricultural system at a systems level, at a landscape level. And then that also allows us to manage not only at the landscape level, but all the way down to not only the farm, the field, the row, the crop, but down to the inches, right? So we go both up at a landscape level and down to the very small level on a farm. And that allows us then to do predictive modeling, right? We can model an entire system with more rigor than we have ever been before if we can use this new data technologies to supply that kind of information. And so we think about things such as carbon sequestrations in soils. There's a lot of just amazing amount of data available in this area, from all the way from the microbiome, what's in soil, to what practices mitigate or sequester more carbon, et cetera. And bringing that all together to be able to make decisions is really important. And Claudia talked about food insecurity. And really, if you think about that economic layer, what is going to allow a farmer to produce nutritional food, have that food available to people across the world, and then still have a viable and profitable agricultural system? That means that we have to bring economic data, which is often left out of the equation, on top of all the biological, physical, and management data that we have. So I'm a big a data fan, and I think agriculture, above almost any other discipline, is really going to be able to benefit from artificial intelligence.
Great. Thank you. Dr. Uldada, what about yourself?
Well, let me pick up on a couple of points. The first one made by Claudia on efficiency. As highlighted earlier, there is a big scope for agriculture to be more efficient because it uses a large amount of water, as you know, about 70% of water, energy, nutrients, etc. And if you just take the example of water use and the need for efficient irrigation, so some of the emerging technologies, particularly in relation to the use of renewable energy in agriculture, particularly in remote areas and for smallholder farmers, where the potential again is huge in enabling smallholder farmers to have access to water, but to use it efficiently. And this is one of the emerging technology that combines, the renewable energy and access to water, for instance, in this case, or the use of renewable energy technology to be able to store food and store medicine as well, obviously in this case. In many parts of the world where farmers would benefit so much of having a technology like renewable energy that can allow them just to have a small refrigeration to store food for just 1 or 2 days makes a huge difference to their food security, having food available for their own consumption and maybe a little bit to take to market and make some profit. And the second point I want to make, in addition to efficiency, is the need for resilience. And here I think Claudia mentioned the use of technology, and I want to mention particularly the increasing use of drones, for instance, where you can monitor the fields and you can actually target the efficient use of irrigation and also application of fertilizers, and to monitor crops for diseases and any other signs of crop failure. And there are other aspects with emerging technologies that need to be really scaled up. In relation to agriculture, I would cite also the use of energy from waste. It's happening in a number of farms, particularly using anaerobic digestion, but basically you're valuing the waste rather than throwing it away and generating energy that can be used in the farm at the same time. And the last point I want to make in terms of emerging technologies and particularly looking at the impact and influence of consumers. So we're seeing a wave of new choices for food, and particularly an increase in plant-based diets. And if you look back a few years ago when vegetarianism was present in certain countries, but even in Europe it wasn't actually really well catered for everywhere. I'm sure if you think just 20-30 years ago, going to a country like France, for instance, and being vegetarian, you probably suffer from that, because it happened to me. I was there actually. So the point I want to make is there is this evolution of choice, and which affects the supply, obviously, and affects the use of technology in coming up with new choices for food, for consumption, but also looking at the broader challenge of an increasing population. How are you going to feed a growing population in 20-30 years time? And that raises in a big question, obviously, about sustainability, about healthy diet, and about the protection of natural resources as well. So these are just some of the examples that come to my mind in terms of emerging technologies in the food systems context.
Thank you so much. And being born in France myself, I can certainly understand how you would have felt in France being a vegetarian. That's heresy over there. Anyway, it's changed somewhat in the last few years. I'm going to go to some of the questions from the audience, and I'll start by a question by Glenn Friesen from Manitoba Agriculture. What strategies would you be using to improve adoption rate and mainly producer adoption rates of climate change adaptation strategies and practices? And he's making a statement that generally speaking, incentive payments are having minimal market penetration. So what would you be, what are the strategies that you believe would be improving adoption rates amongst producer for some of the strategies we were talking about? And Dr. Rocky, I'm going to start by you if that's okay.
Yeah, so it is important to think about adoption, and that's why when we start programs in innovation and science, we often think about what the outcome is going to be and how is it going to be adopted. Yeah, there are incentive markets. There's more and more markets being created, ecosystem services markets. Right now, we're actually funding the research behind a large effort to create the carbon markets and water quality and water quantity markets that incentivize farmers. But in my mind, it goes way beyond that. And there's also in the United States conservation payments that they've included a lot of now climate smart practices that can be then eligible for climate for conservation reserve payments, and that is helpful too. But in my mind, the most important thing we can do is give the great advice on knowledge-based practices that their whole cloth are going to allow a farmer to not only mitigate climate and help mitigate climate change, but provide for that profitable farm. Because in and of itself, a farmer has to be able to make a living. And when they make these decisions about their practices that they're going to deploy, they have to think about all sorts of things. And oftentimes, whether or not they're putting the most climate smart practices into play is down the ladder. When we provide knowledge and science that allows them to say, hey, this climate, I have a choice between two practices. This one has a climate smart aspect to it and is also going to allow me to be more profitable. They're going to make that decision. So it really is about providing the knowledge and background for them to choose those practices and then to systematically change what they're doing in order to meet whatever goals they have for not only their farm, but for the community. So I really believe that we have to have farmers in from the beginning of any project to figure out what their motivations are behind adopting these practices, and understanding those motivations is really, really important.
Dr. Oldada, I'm going to go to you now for the same question.
Oh, thank you. I would say, in terms of strategies and for the adoption of these practices, we can look at who actually do farmers listen to, and I think often you find that farmers listen more to farmers, and that's really an important influential avenue that can be used more efficiently than certain strategies or practices that you want to communicate otherwise. So I would say, this is really an important, way to think about when you want to communicate with farmers and get them to adopt certain practices. Because coming from experts or, from scientists, unless obviously you connect well with farmers and, sort of be convincing and speak the same language, you're not going to have the impact that you would like to see. And this applies in any other disciplines, really, in general, I would say. But for farming, just from my previous experience talking to farmers, you get this reality. The other thing I would say is when you have practices that have been proved to be effective, then presenting those to farmers and explaining to them what would be the benefit of doing something that is good for climate change, and as Sally said, good for their business, good for revenues, then you get take up for that as well. And I'll give you an example. We've been promoting climate smart agriculture practices in different countries. And we included in that a training program where you train the experts and train farmers. And as I was saying, you train the people who connect better with farmers on the field. They know the local realities and circumstances, and that seems to be more influential. So for me, that's another example of getting the option for these practices and strategies.
Thank you. Dr. Ringler.
Yeah, I mean, from the field work I was involved with, just a few quick points. So the first point is perception that the climate is changing. So if you don't have the perception, for example, irrigating farmers are less likely to notice that the climate is changing because the crops seem to be doing quite well, even if it's a bit hotter, even if it rains less regularly. So yeah, there has to be perception that climate is changing, and that perception is, interestingly, it's gendered. So women farmers might have a different perception from men farmers. The type of climatic changes that are being perceived also vary quite dramatically. So based on the perception of what's happening, that's then how the information has to be provided. I mean, we have to respond to perceptions and to the understanding. And what we've seen is that information is one of the largest bottlenecks that farmers, at least in low-income countries, face. So, and then who is a farmer? Again, we work a lot with women farmers, and they say there's a lot of NGOs that come, to our villages, and they say we want to talk to farmers. And then right away, women feel that they're not being addressed and they stay at home. But if an NGO comes and says we want to talk to the community, then they feel that they can come to the table. So there's a huge gap. There's these farmer field days where women can go to. There are associations where you have to be a landowner to be invited and so forth. So there's a lot of gaps of information. Also, the type of information that extension services provide is still very often limited on climate change. So it's getting much better, but traditional extension surveys, education, focuses on some core food security crops. So when we have to elect the nutritional diversity, then they focus on core practices. You put so much fertilizer then, and you take this seed. So even irrigation, for example, in Africa, there's very little capacity on irrigation. So yeah, we need to do more on capacity building. It could be traditional extension service. It can be modern, digital services also on climate information. Again, we don't trust the weather, so farmers don't trust weather services. That so there's a lot of also education on probabilities and things that has to be provided. And we need to use more innovative extension services for climate smart agriculture and other technologies. But again, there is a digital gender divide. We know that women don't have access to mobile phones to the same extent as men have. We know that they're much less likely to use internet. So yeah, we have to, lift up. We have to be very proactive in terms of reducing gender gaps we generate by strengthening climate change adaptation in developing countries. And then there's the question, we can come up with great technology. Solar power, solar power irrigation is a great technology that we are also, trying to find ways to link poorer farmers with, but a normal farmer just can't afford it. So there are no credit products out there, that go beyond a seasonal repay rate, or that understand that this particular product actually reduces climate risk, so you should have a lower rate. So yeah, there's a whole gamut of things that needs to be done if you're more serious in accelerating adaptation. And maybe just also a quick word, when 12 years ago, we came to Kenya, we said we want to promote climate smart, we explained what it is. they're like mitigation, that's not us. We didn't generate the emissions. We are absolutely not reducing our fertilizer applications. We need to increase it. I'm like, exactly. We're all with you. You do need to increase your fertilizer application. You need to produce more meat, because obviously we don't want to increase food insecurity. We want to improve it. But if you think about, and then you really have to talk through. You have to talk this through. We are all here with you. We are not against you. And then if farmers then understand that increasing feed efficiency, improving feed quality for livestock, so this very poor feed quality that livestock receives in many of these countries, you improve it, your output, your methane per liter of milk produced, it just goes down because you produce so much more milk if you improve feed efficiency. So we can also mitigate climate change in countries by increasing efficiency, as Zitouni also said. So a lot has to be dialogue, right? Because we want to make it very clear we have common goals, and no one wants to worsen climate change. Everyone wants to help, but food security is coming first, and it can be done. We just have to work with partners. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to another question that was asked. I'm going to go for it quickly because it's related to the last one, and I'll ask any of you if you want to say something about it, if you want to answer, or we'll move on to the next prepared question. But basically, the question is dealing with the fact that some farmers have been already doing the best that they can to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by doing things such as reduced tillage to varying extents. But they're not able to claim any offset as there no new offset being created. And mainly what is being said is that they're being penalized for having done the right thing for decades, versus someone who's suddenly going to discover that they can do the same thing and reduce greenhouse gas emission. So basically the question is, can any of you suggest policy approaches that basically reward people who have been doing the right thing for decades in terms of, on the farm? If any of you wants to take a stab at that question.
Well, one thing I would say is that if you have ecosystem services markets, those that are already there are going to get the most return, because, for example, with carbon markets, those that are already sequestering a large amount of carbon would be able to get the advantage of over somebody who's in a transition or is improving their systems to sequester more carbon. So one of the ways to do that is ecosystem service credit markets that reward those that are already there because they're sequestering more carbon, would be able to get value for that.
Great, thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah,
well, I mean,
please.
Go ahead.
Okay, I would just wanted to say the additionality problem, that I think that's what's being raised here. So yes, that is a challenge, and I think it's what Sally said. Then you look for alternative incentives. I mean, if countries like Canada, United States, and so forth, who have and Europe put up very ambitious new mitigation aspirations and goals, and they want to bring all farmers in. So those who have already done a lot of whatever minimum till, zero till, other soil carbon sequestration practices. And by the way, they don't work that well, and many soils are not really doing that well. Many countries, you just don't get much out of it. And I think first doing much better measurements. So there was this discussion if agriculture is a net sink or a net source of emissions in Canada. Anyway, I think we follow whatever the government says, and right now they see there's still substantial emissions that we can do something about. So yeah, I think the government and everyone will come up very quickly with very innovative ways to improve incentives for farmers, and I hope it's incentives and not penalties. Incentives for farmers to do better. With could be local markets. For carbon gains, planting, more agroforestry practices, etc. So I think we don't need to worry too much about if we measure everything perfectly right now. And what do we do with the additionality challenge? Because the governments now have made promises and they have to live up to these promises, and they will find ways to account for a lot more mitigation options than they've ever done before. So I think there's a lot of opportunities out there. As I said, again, hopefully they keep in mind that they should not try to reduce production dramatically.
Thank you. Dr. Uldada?
I think there are some countries who are looking at the public services for public goods policies, including the EU and the UK, and trying to have mechanisms where you can actually pay farmers not just to produce food, but to look after the environment and the ecosystem where food is being grown and animals are being kept. So this is the first aspect, so that you start looking at, what does food production mean really? What does it take? It's not only just about, growing food, as I said. And that means that there's a big question of whether farmers should be rewarded for protecting the quality of water because of the river that runs through the farm, protecting the soil, of course, that's a big capital for farmers. And the other aspect, which is for us as consumers, what price are we prepared to pay for food? Because at the moment, in general, food is cheap. And I don't think we're paying really the right value of food. So we need to ask ourselves the question as well, that if we are prepared to pay that cost because you value the food that protects the soil and the environment and the biodiversity, etc., then we have a responsibility to play there as well. So it's much broader than just thinking of rewarding farmers just like that. It's really much more complicated than that, and we're all sort of concerned in this, and we need to think about the real cost, the real value of food, I would say.
Can I just add one other thing? I appreciate both the panelists' comments. I think one thing to remember too is beyond incentivizing farmers, when there is a disaster, which we see more and more of with climate change, those farmers that have been progressive in adopting climate smart practices after a dramatic event such as a flood and or drought, they tend to come out further ahead. And as Dr. Uldada had said, farmers talk to each other, farmers see what's happening on each other's farms. And if there's a dramatic ability to be profitable during a drought or a flood on one farm because they've adopted climate smart practices as opposed to another, there's nothing more important for these farmers to recognize that adopting these practices does in the end provide a more resilient agriculture and does in and of itself make you more profitable, because resiliency translates into profitability under climate stress.
Appreciate that. Thank you very much for those answers. Before we go back to questions from our attendees, I'd like to go to some of our prepared questions. I'm going to ask for short answers if possible, while still going through big questions. And the next one I think is going to be on government, the role of government. We've seen what I would call a debauchery of promises by 40 world leaders a few weeks ago, conveyed by President Biden, and they all try to outpace each other by promising even more cuts in GHG emissions. It was nice. It was interesting to see. They wanted to outdo each other. The problem often is those promises are unkept. And a few years later, we see the same promises being made and no real deliverables on that. So, based on your views and your organization's views, what would be the top 2 or 3 policies that the government could put in place to really advance positive changes in relations to climate change and the role of agriculture. So top 2 or 3 policies, and I'm going to start by Dr. Rocky.
Well, I'll talk about the United States agriculture a little bit to have an example. We know that one of the top policies, I think, would be to support science and innovation. That absolutely has to be at the core of everything that we do. And in the United States, you recognize that agricultural sciences only represent 2% of the R&D that the government supports. There has just been an introduction as of yesterday of a new legislation to increase the amount of funding that goes to agricultural science by 5% per year over the next 10 years, so to increase it by a half over the next 10 years. But unless we're willing to invest in the science and technology that it's going to take, we are going to be left behind. I mean, it's amazing in my mind how far we have come in agriculture, given that the funding levels are so much smaller than some of our other sectors, such as biomedicine or other sectors like that. So I think first and foremost, the governments have to come together to agree that science and innovation is one of the ways that we're going to get through this. And then I think on the other side of that is regulation. And to the degree science and innovation can prevent regulatory systems coming into play that force farmers into certain methodologies that they would otherwise not use, it's always better to have them adopt their systems and not be regulated into change. So I think that, again, it all comes back to supporting that science and technology and that budget so that we can give knowledge-based information and farmers can be empowered to use that to the best of their abilities. And by nature, government should think about this way out instead of the regulatory route.
Thank you. I appreciate those answers. Dr. Uldada.
Well, let me take the example of food loss and waste. Globally, we throw away around 1/3 of the food that is produced for human consumption. And that's responsible for around 8% of greenhouse gas emissions. And we always say that if food loss and waste were a country, it would be the 3rd emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not something to underestimate. And I agree with Sally on the point of regulation. Absolutely critical, and this is what the governments can do to make a big difference. And I'll give you an example for the food loss and waste. It started in France, Serge, I think that the policy, where the government put in law to forbid supermarkets from throwing food away, but to have alliances with charities so that the food can be used by charities and brought to the people who need it rather than throw it away. And I think this is something that can be done everywhere. You know, all the supermarkets everywhere should have this kind of partnership or alliance with charities so that actually the food is not thrown away. Because as I said earlier, we have around 700 million people who go hungry every day. So it's immoral to throw the 1/3 of food that we produce and all the energy and resources that go into producing it. So for me, this is something that can make a big difference. It's proved to be feasible and efficient, and it should be really made across the board.
Great, thank you. Dr. Ringler.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, obviously, with both Sally and Zitouni. So, I mean, be serious about sustained investment in science and innovation is crucial. That's the number one. And we've had this side discussion in the Q&A on sinks and sources, you know. So yes, there will never be agreement on some of the emissions values, you know, because we don't have that good measurement devices, in part because it didn't matter that much before. You just use some generic standards and you slap them on some values. Yes, I think we should do much better. And you know, the little research that CGR has done is that the potential, you know, is not in some of those core practices like zero till is not as large, you know, as some people wish. And yeah, we would like to see. And then there is more potential in other areas. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't put too much money onto the measurement, but certainly we do need better measurement, and we need some better agreement as well. But what we really need is innovations to radically, reduce emissions in agriculture, and increase adaptation. So that remains key. And of course, I also agree, there are these other areas in terms of what are we consuming, what are we wasting, so that everyone at home can do something about this, supporting reducing emissions in the food system, directly and indirectly. One thing that we should not be doing, and I guess that's maybe the point I'll add, is restricting trade to reduce leakage, or we should be extremely careful. I mean, the UK, for example, has already done measurements, and they state that any livestock produced outside the UK has 10% higher emissions than if it's produced in the UK. And so that means, we should not necessarily import livestock. I mean, and that's fine for the UK, I don't worry too much about it. But if you're now saying, low income countries, the way they produce food, it generates higher emissions because, among others, they don't have the perfect livestock feeding strategies, crop yields are low, so they use a lot of land, that potentially was, tropical forest and so forth. So now we don't import, food anymore. We don't import agricultural commodities, or we don't export to them because now we need our own food. I mean, anyway, trade restriction, very, very, very bad idea to achieve mitigation goals. So I just want to make that plea. It will cause all kinds of havoc. We're talking about growing extreme events, more droughts, floods. We need to keep trade routes open, and we can't, use leakage and other measures to just say, sorry, no food in, no food out. It would be a very, very bad measure. Thanks.
I think we've heard your message. Thank you. I think it was interesting to hear about the need for sustained investment in research and innovation. We've been certainly pushing for that. The recent federal budget was not, in Canada, was not certainly following the previous trends in terms of funding on research and innovation. Certainly went down, different priorities, I guess, and understandably so with the pandemic, but it has an impact as well. So we're hoping to see changes and better budgets in the future. I hope nobody from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada is listening. Probably are. I'm going to go to the next question, if that's okay. And I'm going to go to a question from one of our attendees. And again, I'll open up to any of you if panelists, they want to answer, let me know. Just raise maybe your hand. If not, I'll just move on to another question. How do we measure soil carbon levels so we can track improvements in soil sequestration and evaluate farm practices to see which ones really make a difference? So it's measurement. Any of you would like to take a stab at answering this?
Well, I guess that's the holy grail, right, of the measurement. So there's two parts to that. There's the first part, which is the baseline. And as Claudia had just mentioned, it is very complex because different groups do it different ways. There's not necessarily one single agreement on how we're going to do it. So that's the first part, the baseline. And then, of course, to measure the incremental change. But the third piece of it is, how do we know what success is? So we don't really have a way to know what the carbon sequestration potential is for a soil. We don't know if we've gotten there. We know we might have sequestered more carbon, but how do we have an idea of whether we've reached the pinnacle of carbon sequestration in a soil? So one of the things that we're very interested in is trying to do that modeling of what the potential for carbon sequestration could potentially be in soils across our country as well as across the world. And but it's a difficult issue. One of the things that we're trying to do with this big initiative that we're having is bring all of the information about all the measurement systems together so that we can, at least people can have access to the metrics and understand also how to apply them.
Anyone else would like to answer? Dr. Ringler?
Yeah, maybe just the fact, and obviously Canada is one, but let's go to low income countries where we have whatever 250 or 280 million smallholder farmers, they're all interested in getting gains, getting some small, what I call charismatic carbon payment, because just a carbon payment of $10 per hectare, if you have 0.2 hectare, yeah, it's maybe not so interesting. So you probably have to do a bit more. But so they are interested. But who's out there who's going to monitor and verify? And then what happens? Prices change, or there was a drought or something, and they've signed up into some contract. Yes, we will exactly do this over the next 5 years, and they can't. So because a shock hits. Could be illness, it could be anything, and they have to completely change their practice. So we have that challenge. So that there are these challenges, at least for annual crops, to really make a difference for farmers from adhering to these practices. And that's why I call it charismatic carbon. We have to be, if you're serious, if you do want smallholder farmers with very small plots to get into this business and to actually benefit from carbon payments, we have to do more than traditional carbon payments that are low and have a lot of reporting and other requirements.
Great. All right, Dr. Oldetta, I didn't see your hand, so I'll move on to the next question again from one of our guests regarding the need to narrow the funding gap as new research investment focusing on managing the climate challenges. What are good approaches to advocate and foster funding towards effective agricultural research in climate change within Canada and also internationally? And before I ask any of you to take a stab at answering that question, I will say, Dr. Hernandez, you could get involved with AIC on that, especially on the Canadian side of it. Your faculty is a member, Dr. Hernandez from the University of Alberta. Your faculty is a member of the AIC, and we're actually just made a plea for members of our policy committee. Now, moving on, any of you would like to answer that question? Again, it's mainly what are the good approaches to advocate for foster funding? Dr. Rocky.
Yeah, I think one thing that happened during COVID was the increased understanding of the public about agriculture. I mean, when we were faced, and it was especially true in the United States, and I'm sure it's true in Canada and across the world, that when we were faced with shortages and other things that affected people directly, there was an increased understanding, or at least an increase in visibility of what agriculture does to your lives and how important agriculture is to your lives. So I think that piece of it, in understanding that agriculture is so intimately connected with the health of not only of the planet, but the health of people, and to have people understand that it is a very connected system. It's connected directly to them, and it's connected directly to the earth, and it's connected directly to each other. That helps with incentivizing the funding for agriculture and emphasizing the importance of agriculture in our everyday lives.
Great. Anyone else would like to take a stab? No? I'll move on to one of our prepared questions, which actually goes very well with one of the comments from one of our attendees. But each of your organizations stresses the importance of working collaboratively with stakeholders, notably when it comes to achieving sustainable development goals. Can you talk about the challenges you've encountered in building collaboration and partnerships with stakeholders? What lessons have you learned from those engagements? And as I said, it dovetails very well with one of the comments made by Mike Say, one of our attendees from Genome Prairie, I believe. Farmers as a group are highly suspicious of ideas and approaches being imposed versus developing them together. So please, if you're able to provide some thoughts on this. And Dr. Oldetta, or can I throw it at you first?
Sure. Well, collaboration is key, without really saying, is absolutely critical. And you have to collaborate with organizations and people from across the spectrum. But having said that, of course, in practice, it's not that easy. it's not always just you can collaborate with anyone, and at least when you have internal procedures and legal procedures you have to go through to facilitate that. But if you look at all the issues we've been talking about, they are global challenges, they are global issues. So it's normal that you need to work with people and organizations from different backgrounds. I think often, and as Sally said initially, there is this kind of isolation and working in silos, and that applies across the board really, and many disciplines operate like that, unfortunately. So for me, really to have good collaboration, you need to make that first connection first, and to see what benefit you're going to get from that collaboration. I wouldn't say to look at collaboration just like that in the broader sense and just say you need to collaborate. Well, collaborate for what? And if you're going to join forces and make things better, make a better impact, and make a difference to people's lives, then it's worth it. I'm not aware of any experience, to be honest, where there were any particular problems or lessons learned, because I would say that you need to look at these things up front before you commit into collaboration. And that's why you have dialogue, you have discussion that allows you to understand each other and see, well, what actually you're going to contribute to, and what difference you're going to make, what you're going to deliver. Sometimes there are other aspects involved where you need financial contributions to make the collaboration works, and that adds to the challenges and complexity. But for me, the main thing is to really forge a collaboration or a partnership that can add value, that can make a difference. For me, that's the main thing.
Appreciate that. Dr. Ringler?
Yeah, maybe just two points to add. I think one thing we need is more stories of success. So, yes, agriculture, is a huge and has been a huge sink, for carbon. And that story, I agree with all of the Q&A people, has not been told as much as the emission story, and obviously particularly livestock emission story. So yes, we need to bring out the successes of agriculture much more. And of course, not necessarily hold open the hand as like, oh, we have done something, now we want to get money. But first bring out the success, and then invite others, to work with farmers and associations that have generated that success, because the success is not everywhere, right? So we can transmit that success and explain and build capacity for other farmers and in other places. So we do need the stories of success. And then, for mitigation, I think this is just such a great opportunity for innovative partnerships, because we obviously want someone who's willing to buy the offset, right? So is it the airline industry? I mean, it's obviously a difficult example right now, but an industry that most likely, obviously they're also trying to do much better, but maybe they say, okay, we're sequestering more carbon through working with a province in Canada, right? I mean, so there can be new interesting deals, they can be made. There are sellers, there's buyers, there are people out there, they're waiting for ways to aggregate, to get numbers that they can again sell to their clients. So, I mean, a lot is already going on. I mean, there's extremely active carbon markets and these brokers, they're out there. And again, I think what I want to say is that as a result of these very ambitious statements that these leaders have been made, I think these brokers and everything is already operating. I can see things working. I mean, people are looking, to make these linkages, to forge these linkages. So there is no other way if we want to be serious about these ambitious goals. Yeah, so I just see a lot of potential for great new stakeholder partnerships to achieve common goals. It's much more difficult in low-income countries, where we have millions of farmers and they need aggregators, many more levels to get to a goal. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, and I think there is common agreement that partnership are essential. It's about the challenges in developing those partnerships. Dr. Rocky.
Well, yeah, and I also would like to add on to Claudia's comments in that if you think about where we've come, that talking about that success is really important because agriculture tends to be viewed as the villain in this. And actually, if you think about where we've come from the 1950s and 60s, where we had the Green Revolution, which really used chemistry and genetics and then modern scientific techniques to move us, and the amount of land that we use for the yield that we give, it's just incredible what's happened especially over the past 25 years. So I think it's important that we build on those successes. We are in the business of public-private partnerships, and they, as Zatuni said, they are not easy. I mean, they are something that you have to start out, and I think it's important, as what he had said, that you have to figure this out from the beginning. So the most important thing is find those partners that have shared goals and values. And when it's about science, it's very interesting because we oftentimes bring competitors together to sit at the table. We often bring groups that you would otherwise never think of collaborating, such as groups that work on animal welfare versus meat companies together at the table. So they're strange bedfellows, but we're going to use science to advance everyone's mission. So you have to have those shared goals and values at the very beginning. That's what makes these kind of relationships work. In particular with ours, bringing the stakeholders, the farmers in at the beginning is really important. You have to agree on your rules of engagement. How are you going to work with each other? You know, that's very important. In our world, because we deal with many companies, we have to talk about intellectual property and how we manage intellectual property. And because we're publicly funded, we have to talk about what can be available publicly versus other things. And then I think the point that Claudia was making, you really have to have skin in the game, right? If you have that shared values, everyone has to have some sort of skin in the game. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is money. It's often good when it's money, but it's other things that are available. And everyone has to think that there's synergy in this, there's value in these relationships, that we can achieve more together than we could alone. And the day in the science world, as expensive as science is, there is a lot of value of collaborating together because you really get economies of scale when you work together. And if you have an organization like FAR that matches these groups, they're getting a lot of funding, a bang for the buck. In other words, they get maybe 3 to 4 times as much research as what they would otherwise be able to do alone. And then finally, I think Claudia made this point, you really got to celebrate your successes together. But you also have to share the responsibility if there's failure. So, you know, both of those things have to all be agreed upon. And I will just say that I'm coming from government where I did not work in establishing public-private partnerships very often to this whole role of establishing public-private partnerships. There's been a real sea change in the agriculture community and a willingness, much more so, even in the 7 years that I've been here, a willingness to work together like we haven't seen before. And so that makes our lives a little bit easier in this world.
Absolutely, and we've seen it in Canada as well. And I will echo the comments of one of our attendees here, Dr. Laura Gustafson, sorry, when she mentions the work done by Protein Industries Canada, but not just Protein Industries Canada, the government really, which has funded a super cluster approach and a cluster approach, which is forcing organization to collaborate in various goals, and it's worked well. This cluster approach, call it whatever you'd like, but it's forced people to collaborate. And that's probably one of the roles that government can do, is push and fund and force collaboration on that front. And before we've got another 10 minutes, I'm going to ask your comments very quickly on another question posed by one of our attendees before we go to our closing comments. But one of the things, and Dr. Catani is mentioning that is governments have a tendency to fund research that will provide a new product or a new service, especially agricultural departments, but they are reluctant to fund something that is much more holistic in approach and really technologies that may be widely adopted without increasing crop inputs, but that has value to the earth's benefit that producers are not compensated for. So, funding that is a little bit more holistic in approach rather than really for a product or a service. Do you see this as an issue as well, where governments are really using research funds to in a very limited way and prescriptive way, rather than looking at the good and the well-being of the planet in general and our environment? Anyone that wants to touch that?
I can start because I worked in the government for 30 years funding research. The interesting part is that at least in the US, we have a mandate to fund fundamental science. And you can really see in areas like biomedical research how that strong emphasis of funding fundamental science has led to the knowledge base being big enough that you can get very practical and applied outcomes from that fundamental knowledge. In agriculture, I don't think there's enough fundamental research funded. I think the emphasis should be more on fundamental research, particularly as we're getting so complex, such a complex system where basic knowledge from a bunch of different fields, it may be in physics, it may be in engineering, are going to contribute to advances in agriculture. That idea that we fund some of these fundamental principles is really important. And I will tell you an example. We fund the RIPE project, which is realizing increased efficiencies in photosynthetic efficiencies with the Gates Foundation at the University of Illinois. And it is an incredibly fundamental project where we're teasing out every bit and aspect of photosynthesis that we can possibly figure out. In crops that are important to Africa, we have cassava and cowpea, and then we're also working on soybean for the United States. And it's really a fundamental project, but it has had very practical applied outcomes almost immediately. So for example, by manipulating photosynthesis, we've increased yield by 50% in some cases. We've increased water use efficiency by 25%. So that's just a demonstration of understanding the fundamental, and the fundamental research can really lead you to much very quick in agriculture in particular. So the average amount of time that agricultural science is applied is only 2 years. It's 20 years in some other disciplines, and some disciplines 30 years, but in agriculture it's very short. So that idea, and I don't really even believe that there's such a thing as fundamental or applied research in agriculture. It's really gray. All of those basic principles are applied almost immediately. So I am a big proponent of getting the knowledge base as big as we possibly can for agriculture, and that the government should be a big source of that funding.
And we've seen it with canola in Canada in the multi-billion-dollar sector now. For a 30-second answer, Dr. Ringler, as we're nearing the end of our session. So 30 seconds, please.
Yeah, also, just from what Sally said, I've been, this year is 25 years with CGR for me. So, and what I've seen is also this erosion on fundamental research. Our donors, now request that we generate outcomes on the ground within 3 years. And so we are trying to do it while actually doing the important research that we feel is needed. And so, yeah, it has become a struggle. So, the duration, the understanding that research takes time, that a lot of the products are not yet known when we start, that there's risks and so forth. Yeah, it's something we have to live with. The lack of investment in basic research is unfortunately, it has been dramatically growing in CGR. And in terms of single sector versus multiple goals, yes, that remains a very big challenge. Departments, funders are still largely single sector oriented, and they can generate multiple benefits, including for the environment or costs. And as long as they stay siloed and they're not looking at the ramifications yeah, that means we'll face more risks, and it's an unfortunate situation that still exists. Sorry.
Okay, no, that was a little bit more than 30. I think it was 45 at least. Dr. Oldata, unless you want to answer that, I'll move on to the final question, which I will give you a minute or so. Are you okay with?
Please move on. Move on.
Move on. Great.
Yeah.
So it's my prerogative as the moderator to ask the last question, and one that is not prepared. So I'm going to ask you in a few seconds to try to give me a sense. You're all representing international organizations or organizations based outside of Canada, and the audience here is a Canadian audience from universities, governments, industry, and others, private sector as well. I'm going to ask you, what could Canada do better, and what leadership can Canada bring to the table in this case? So again, I know it's a little bit of a bigger answer than a minute, but I'm still going to ask you to limit it to a minute, if that's okay. And I will actually watch the clock because I do want to finish on time for our attendees. So leadership, Canada, what do you think? And I'm going to start by you, Dr. Oldata.
Well, you put me on the spot. I'm not very familiar with the Canadian policies, and I don't have any particular suggestion to make. Since we're talking about research, I would say, and in the area of agriculture and climate change, I would say to bring something that Canada would want to promote around the world, because it works and they want everyone to benefit from that, either an advancement in research or an idea for collaboration with other countries and other organizations. So apologies for not being specific, because I'm not familiar with Canadian policies and research, but this would be my suggestion.
And your answer is already an answer, Dr. Oldata. If you're not familiar with what Canada is doing, it's probably an issue of leadership in that role that Canada has not exercised as well. Dr. Ringler.
Okay, Canada is one of the few countries where the production frontier is growing. So you can produce possibly more because of climate change. It's getting warmer. So what are the learnings? What are the risks? What are the learnings for other countries? There's the peatlands. I know that's not agriculture, but I see huge risks there, and I don't see much being done about that. They're all defrosting, huge emissions to come. Then, keep trade routes open, don't close them. Canada is a very important exporter of grains, wheat, etc. So there's a lot of poor countries that will need them going forward because of climatic stresses. And then, of course, any learnings from this great soil carbon sequestration that is very heavily reported. There's a lot of countries that still have a lot to learn on that.
Thank you. Dr. Rocky?
Yeah, we share our border, of course, with Canada, and we're great partners with Canada. I think Canada has one thing that, as you said, knowing of where the Canadian strengths are in science and innovation, I think is really important. We, of course, have worked with Canada directly on many things, such as pulse crops, on rangeland, on wheat, some of the areas that Canada is extraordinarily strong in. But I think in this whole area of climate change and agriculture, Canada is very strong. So to the ability that you can promote those areas of science where you have your strengths, I think that's a great way to go.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our attendees. We were not able to get to all the questions, but we got to a number of them. Thank you really very much for participating. I believe, Dr. Oldata, it's a bit later for you in the day. So have a good evening, have a good afternoon for the rest of you. And hopefully some of our attendees will be joining us in the next session, which will be in May. And there will be another session as well in June, and please check on our website to look at it. So I'm pleased to see some of the comments on the Q&As, and thank you again very much to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.